Hey folks, here is part two of your video. So we were talking about the discussion, the discussion board questions. So we ended on the different types of podcasts, right? So hopefully you've looked at that. You've chosen a type of podcast, right? Do you want to do a monologue where you interview someone? Do you want to do a more theatrical storytelling podcast? Do you want to do a roundtable with some people you know? And in that reading on the eight different types, there are in each category there's two real live podcasts you can click or look at that are great examples of that type of podcast. Right? There's a storytelling podcast. There's a monologue podcast like Philosophize This. Right? So you have a lot of good examples just within that reading. Okay, so those are the types of podcasts. Um, and remember, right, our podcasts are informative, they're persuasive, they can be argumentative. Um, they should not just be entertainment, right? You can use entertainment in the service of education for the podcast, but these are not entertainment based podcasts. I know a lot of us are listening to like entertaining podcasts, so do I. But we're doing more of think of like the Ezra Klein show. Ezra Klein, interviews someone on like a major topic of the week in the news and has a really engaging breakdown, right? History of the topic, different points of view on the topic. This week Ezra Klein was talking about advertising on the internet, right, and how that drives the internet, and it's a $500 billion business. And he brought on like an expert. Okay, question 4, define your audience, right? Who is your audience for this podcast? Folks, it can't be like the world or, the universe or, right, even Americans is really too big, okay? So I really want you to start thinking about what is my topic and who is my specific audience. So let me give you an example. My topic for this podcast, I actually have a podcast on making your own dog food by hand. So I can sort of outline this with the outline, right? I'll sort of give my example and I'll sort of show you how I have a very specific audience for my podcast. So I'll pull up the podcast outline, right? And think of this as our first draft of an outline. We'll probably return to this again next week and keep working with the outline prompt. Here it is. Okay, the outline prompt. So, right, you really want to think of this as just like a paper, just like a speech. You really need to plan out what's going to be in your podcast, right? So this is your outline. You're brainstorming. This is your organization. We'll listen to a podcast a little bit later, and we'll break it down into a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? You can do that for any podcast. They usually start with music. On the Ezra Klein show, he always says, "Hi, this is the Ezra Klein show," right? So there's an introduction to the self. Sometimes there's a personal narrative for how someone got interested in the topic that they're talking about, right? That's all the introduction. Or you get this, here's a problem, right? And I'll structure my podcast that way, right? Problem is the 2007 dog food, pet food recall, and the problems with feeding your pet processed food their entire life from a bag, right? That's a problem. They're not eating living food. They're not getting phytonutrients. They're not getting everything that we get from eating, real vegetables, real food, right? Real amino acids, right? So I would start my podcast. It would be a problem solution structure. So let me just sort of show you, and I include my example on here, but I'll just sort of do the blank version. What is your podcast about? My podcast is about informing pet owners, right? American dog and cat pet owners about sort of the dangers or why feeding your pet from a can or a bag their whole life, maybe not the best thing, right? It's like, do you want to eat from a bag or a can your whole life? And I'll also go into how veterinarians are often tied to like selling dog food, right? If you go to any Banfield in Seattle, they also sell dog food and cat food. So they have sort of a vested interest in promoting a product, right? So I don't know if they want you to home cook their dog food. So yeah, my podcast is about informing, it's about advocating, it's about educating, it's about persuading, right? It's not about entertaining, although it will be entertaining because I'm just so entertaining. Is there a narrator? Yes, it's me. Will I interview anyone? Yeah, I'm going to interview two people in my life. My mother, who has fed our sort of dogs in Florida pet food kibble from a bag their whole life. And I'll ask her, why does she do that? Does she think that is healthy for them? Why, just why that and not making food? And then I'll interview a friend of mine. She uses that farmer's dog pet food. It's like handmade dog food that's shipped to your door, right? It's on dry ice, but it's like fresh, right? It uses fresh vegetables and it's all brought to your door. Speaking of pet food, my dog just came over. So I plan to interview two people, right, for two different perspectives on this topic. Storytelling, yeah, I'm going to include a little bit of storytelling in my podcast. I'm going to tell the story of the 2007 pet food recall, where thousands of Americans' dogs and cats were sickened, right? People literally watched their dogs and cats die before them over a period of days because their livers were zapped by chemicals that got in the dog food and cat food. People literally watch their animals just pull themselves across the floor and die over a period of 2. So, right, it's going to be a little gory. It's really sad. It's horrible that this happened. But I'm going to include that for pathos, for emotion. So that'll be a story. That'll probably be in the middle. I could also start my podcast with that story, right? I think that's a great introduction, right, to hook my audiences. Let me tell you, hi, this is the Johnny Calavita Show. Let me tell you a short story about the 2007 pet food recall, right? And then I start that story, and then the middle of my podcast, I can move into the interviews. I can also bring in a couple Google Scholar sources about the history of dog food in this country, right? People fed their dogs and cats table scraps in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, because that's all there was. There was not the processed pet food industry. It wasn't until the 1950s where that whole process of like microwaving and flash freezing food came into existence. So there was no kibble before the 1950s. It was all table scraps. So I guess I'm arguing that we should go back to that, right? And not just table scraps, but like the healthy table scraps. My podcast will include sounds, so will yours. We'll look at how to do that. I'll play some free music from the BBC or the YouTube free audio library. My ideas for the beginning is to introduce myself, to use some storytelling techniques to talk about the story, and to maybe highlight a few pets who suffered and died from the 2007 pet food recall. Right, I'll highlight one or two of their stories. And then the middle is my interviews, and then the end is I'm going to show you how to make a dog food recipe, right? I'll talk about boiled chicken and mashed peas and mashed carrots and adding a little bit of coconut oil or olive oil and greens because dogs love and can eat all of that, and that hits all of their nutritional requirements. So I'll just sort of give a simple menu, right, or recipe at the end of my podcast. Right, and then I would just write my rough outline here. But that's it, folks. I want you to really start thinking about, okay, what is my topic? Who's my audience? My audience is Americans, pet owners, or pet guardians. I don't really like owners. We don't own anybody or anything, or everything is borrowed in this life. It's all on loan. American pet guardians, right? And who are, open to this conversation or being persuaded about maybe, starting to make your dog or your cat's pet food by hand, right? Because it's healthier, just like real food instead of processed food. So that's my outline, and I'm sticking with it, right? That's my real simple outline, and I give also that's written down in this week. So if you just want to look at, right, here's my example of it, right? This is just me filling out the outline. So you have that, right? So you can take a look at that if that's helpful. And then just going back to some of the discussion questions, right? The purpose of my podcast, Inform, Educate. Again, we know who my audience is for pet guardians who are open, to maybe feeding their dogs and cats in a healthier way. And, right, that's really it. That's the discussion this week. That's the outline this week. And I want you to also start listening to some podcasts. This is going to be really helpful for your podcast to see how they're made, to see how they're done. And I'm going to make a video next week that we'll listen to a podcast or two together, and we'll just sort of chart and track and analyze and take that podcast apart, right? They use music, right, in the beginning. They introduce themselves. They tell a short story, right? And then they start with an interview or two. They start looking at sources, or if it's a conversation-based podcast, right, they introduce themselves. They start conversing about the topic, different points, right, from the outline that they made. Then they end on, some more music and maybe like a concluding, final thoughts or what they really want us to take away from this podcast. So I would say, if you don't listen to podcasts, find a podcast on a topic that you think you want your podcast to be on, right? Our final podcast together, and see how they do it, right? If you're interested in like aeronautics or space or books or plane, right? Whatever your topic of the podcast is, right? Start listening to a podcast on that to see how they really break it down. And then I think my last thought is, just like a paper, you also need to narrow, right? You need to narrow your topic for this podcast. So I have people who love true crime, right? So what are you going to say about true crime? You want to start narrowing it down, okay? So I go on Google Scholar and I start noticing the conversation on true crime, right? I notice, okay, a lot of women listen to true crime because the true crime genre often tells you how to avoid violence, right? I noticed that, in this article, true crime is affecting jurors and their expectations in the courtroom. I'm like, that's interesting, right? So start looking at the conversation on true crime, right? And ethics. What does it mean to listen to, right, the details about someone's life? This will help you start narrowing it down, right? Like, what do I want to talk about true crime? Or I have a student who is doing a basketball podcast, and right, it's not just like the history of basketball. It's like, okay, let's talk about physical fitness in basketball, right? Or how best to train young players, or endurance in basketball players, right? Like all of these things, agility, right? Like anything. You can also do, right, injury, right? How to prevent injuries. What does it mean for sports athletes? Like, what is it like a day in the life of a sports athlete, right? Right. Tell us what that is. So yeah, you really want to narrow it down rather than like, basketball in general. Like, this is what it's like to be a sports athlete, right? There's these challenges, there's injuries, right? It's balancing, right, academics with sports, right? That's a more narrow topic. Okay, folks, thank you. Any questions, email me as always.